One of the experiences I trust every homebrewer shares is the feeling of awe that comes from witnessing the conversion of wort into beer through the fermentation process. Even after 15 years, I still get giddy when I see the first signs of airlock activity, a nice fluffy kreuzen developing on top of my beer. The worst is when this takes too long. You all know the anxiety that comes from checking on a batch a day after pitching and seeing no action. This is why we love Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch-right pouch, which assures quick starts, healthy fermentation, and predictably great results. I strongly urge all of our listeners to check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Brewlosophy podcast while you're at it. All right, on to the show. Brewing is a fairly convoluted process involving multiple steps that are required to produce a batch of beer. One of those steps is fermentation, which is when yeast convert the sugar extracted from malt to alcohol and CO2. And considering yeast is a living organism, it is widely believed that pitching a proper amount is imperative to producing a quality beer with no off flavors, particularly as it pertains to lager styles. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to talk about the impact yeast pitch rate has on international pale lager is contributor Jordan Folks.
You know, a lot of new home brewers, their first batch of beer doesn't turn out that good. And I think that, you know, a lot of people in our world have chalked it up to extract. And I've always kind of had this hunch that maybe a part of it's, you know, yeast health, yeast vitality, viability, pitch rate. Because your first home brew, you know, you're just pitching whatever they give you, maybe taped to the bottom of the can, you know, and yeast really makes a big difference in quality beer.
Absolutely. Yeast pitch rate is one of those things that was drilled into the heads of most brewers, definitely me, as being of absolute importance. Not only can underpitching result in sluggish and potentially even stalled fermentations, but it can also lead to a beer with unpleasant off flavors that you do not want to be in said beer. I definitely took yeast pitch rate seriously and built up starters for every batch I brewed for many years, especially if they were lager beers, often pushing 2 liters or more when making lagers. Was it worth it? This is going to be a fun one. All right. On last week's episode, we focused on the current state of homebrewing, which for the sake of brevity, kind of sucks right now. The truth is it's not just homebrew shops and large associations who are feeling the hit of this lull. Us content creators are as well. And while our love for doing what we do at Brewlosophy has kept us going, this is a job that requires a huge investment of time, energy, and money. Just ask Jordan, who I had to convince to do this show with me today. We are fortunate to have sponsors who, despite the current state of things, do continue to support us. But honestly, it's our patrons who have kept us afloat through these difficult times. Unfortunately, though understandably, we've been losing patrons faster than we've been gaining new ones, and nearly all of them let us know that it's because they're no longer brewing. You know, I don't mean to pander. I understand that most people are feeling the pinch right now, but if you really appreciate what it is that we're doing and you want us to keep doing it, we really would love for you to become a patron as well, which in addition to supporting our efforts, earns you some pretty cool rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. This month, July of 2023, our guest is one of the most well-known voices in homebrewing, author of Brewing Classic Styles and co-host, I should say, of the Killer Brew Strong podcast on the Brewing Network, the one and only Jamil Zainasheff. In addition to everything he's done for homebrewing, Jamil founded Heretic Brewing back in 2010 and spent the better part of the last decade running it. And while he's no longer associated with that company, he's got a ton of experience brewing on both the commercial and homebrewing scales. If you want to be a part of this rad session, you have to make your pledge at patreon.com/brewlosophy of just $3 or more, no later than Friday, July 28th, 2023, as Jamil's going to be taking questions that Saturday, the 29th. All past sessions are stored on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. If you wouldn't mind using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're shopping online, we'd appreciate that as well. Feedback this week is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've brewed on both their 120 and 240 volt systems, and these things are absolutely legit, efficient, easy to use. With a relatively small footprint, you will not be disappointed with one of these units. Plus, the guys behind the company run an amazing YouTube channel that you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. Whether you're in the market for electric brewing gear or you just want some basic, brew in a bag brewing gear, you got to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer at clawhammersupply.com. And don't forget to let them know Brewlosophy sent you when you're checking out. That's clawhammersupply.com. Felix von Auloch wrote in from Aargau, Germany after listening to episode 283 to share his experience with non-alcoholic beers. Felix said, I live in the very far south of Bavaria where everything beer is very traditional, sometimes too boring for my tastes. However, alcohol-free, up to about 0.5% ABV, he says, beers are huge and still growing, especially wheat beers, and they are great. They really are a beverage on their own, but they're good. I still prefer the real thing, but there's really a place for it. As an anecdote, when my wife gave birth to our son, the midwives told her to have alcohol-free wheat beer to help her with the milk production. Maybe that she should be tested in an experiment, he says. So when she was in the hospital, I brought her some, which she of course drank from a proper wheat beer glass. She has had a wheat beer each night since, and it's become our evening routine to have a beer together, even though she is still breastfeeding. There are loads of fantastic breweries who do a really good job making non-alcoholic beer, and I'd go as far as saying I think I could convert Marshall. So if you make it to Bavaria, let me know, and we'll have an alcohol-free wheat beer or an alcohol-free Radler or an alcohol-free wheat beer with elderflower. And of course, we'll have plenty of the real ones as well.
Yeah, my girlfriend's brother, one of her brothers, lives in Berlin. And so when we visited him last, I was, just a kid in a candy store and drinking all the German lager I could. And I noticed that there was a ton of non-alcoholic lager, Weiss beer, et cetera, readily available. And, you'd see pregnant women drinking them on the train and stuff like that. And as intrigued as I was to try the plethora of non-alcoholic options, I don't think I tried one because I was too busy getting all the German lager I could in my gullet.
Yeah. No, I hear that. I just got back from a 2-week trip to Europe. We went to Rome, Prague, and then Riga, Latvia. And in every one of those cities, and in fact, we spent a night in Warsaw, Poland as well, saw the same thing. There are quite a few non-alcoholic options, and they're from bigger breweries too. I mean, I've seen non-alcoholic Heineken here in the States, but it was everywhere over there. There was options everywhere. I thought that was pretty interesting. Like you, I didn't try any of them, in part because I'm just not a big fan. Now, if I had $1 for every time someone thought that they could convert me to liking non-alcoholic beers, seriously, I have nothing against these near beers existing. I love the fact that there's an option for people who enjoy them, or like pregnant women who I don't know about I'm not sure the claims that they actually help with lactation are accurate. But hey, if you think they do, that's fine. But in the same way, I'm just not a fan of smoked beers or cantaloupe. I really do not enjoy non-alcoholic beer. And I have finally had them from all of the hot places out there. The biggest, fastest growing brewery right now, I believe, is Athletic. I've had a few of their non-alcoholic beers at this point. It just doesn't really do it for me. I'd rather have sparkling water. But, this just I like the alcohol in my beer. It's a part of the gestalt of beer, and I want it there. So I often go days without drinking beer or any alcohol at all, for that matter. And I don't think about it. It's not like I'm fiending for alcohol or anything. So I will happily sample non-alcoholic beers that people offer me. I'm not going to brew one. I'm not going to go out and spend my money on them. But if you want to share them with me, I'll give you my honest opinion. And as long as you don't get offended, we could have a good time doing that. And then I'm going to move on to the alcohol beer because that's what I tend to prefer. So thank you for hitting us up, Felix. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a line on social media. If you're not already subscribed to the Brewlosophy Show on YouTube, please go do it now at youtube.com/@thebrewlosophy Show. That's the @ symbol followed by the Brewlosophy Show with no umlauts. Martin is producing some really awesome content over there, and we are confident that fans of this podcast will love it just as much. We'll be back with talk of yeast pitch rate when making international pale lager right after these messages. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. I've always had a place in my heart for delicious lagers, particularly those of the yellow fizzy sort. And when I started homebrewing, I definitely envisioned brewing many batches of Pilsner, Helles, and the like. In fact, when I went into the homebrew shop for the very first time, the guy asked me what I wanted to brew, and I said something like Coors Light. I mean, I think a lot of people probably do that. However, like many, I soon realized that doing so required, well, a lot more than brewing ales. So I, like many, avoided it for years. While pitch rate is certainly something brewers of all styles tend to focus on, it's believed to be particularly important when making lagers for a number of reasons. Now, we've focused on pitch rate a couple of times in the past, so while this may be a bit redundant, I would like to start by going over some generals of yeast pitch rate before we get into some of the more specific details.
I think pitch rate is one of the most important levers in the brew house, and it's something that I definitely think about for every beer that I'm making, and it's really, for me, style dependent. You know, I like to go maybe on the lower end for Weiss beers or saisons, kind of in the middle for standard American ales, and then the high end for lagers or high gravity beers. And so ultimately, we're just talking about the number of yeast cells added to the volume of wort, and it's really a function of several different things, temperature, gravity, volume, etc.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I for a long time, I was a diehard yeast pitch rate person. I'll share my opinions as to what has changed, I guess, in my opinions on that in a bit. But I don't think there's much argument against the fact that as a living organism, we need to treat our yeast well. And that means, pitching viable yeast, meaning there are enough cells to do the work we want them to do, as well as vital yeast, yeast that are roaring ready to go. So like you said, Jordan, when we say pitch rate, all we're referring to is the number of cells in a given, a given volume that we're adding to wort, and pitch rate is a function of the volume of wort that we're hoping to ferment into beer. So we use the word proper a lot. I think we use that word a lot. We used to, at least, Jordan. Maybe it's different for you, but by proper pitch rate, really all we're referring to is that we're hitting around the recommended, what the industry standard basically says is a good rate, the number of cells that we're pitching into a specific wort given its OG and volume and such. The two outside of that, if you pitch less than that, we refer to that as underpitching. If you pitch more than that, we refer to it as an overpitch. And both of these have certain, I would say, implications that in certain styles, like you mentioned, Jordan, it might be recommended to underpitch a little bit because you want that yeast to be a little bit more stressed so that it produces, the esters and the phenols that you're after for a specific style. I think in general, when we talk about a proper pitch rate, the goal is to produce a beer that is clean, that is predictable, and where in pitching that you can sort of predict, how long it's going to take to ferment and what the outcome is going to be.
Yeah, totally. And so maybe we can start with some of the things that are allegedly associated with underpitching. So underpitching is pitching less than the recommended range for the given style relative to volume, et cetera. And there are concerns that if you don't use enough healthy, living yeast, you might have an increased lag time. It could take longer for the fermentation to take off. And you'll see that too sometimes with dry yeast, that it's just not, it needs to wake up, and that, don't fear the lag. People can get kind of freaked out sometimes. And if a week goes by and you don't see any bubbles, and it didn't just ferment while you were sleeping, that's a problem.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'll be honest. I'm going to admit that I hate lag, and I will do anything to reduce lag. I think the biggest concern with that is that for the all of the time that the yeast is not actually fermenting that beer, you are at higher risk of getting a contamination. And you can take every step to reduce the risk of contamination. There is always the possibility that some bug got in there and is going to ruin that batch of beer. So I do. One of my biggest things with proper yeast pitch rate, and not underpitching in particular, is that I just want to reduce that lag. In the same way, I don't want a sluggish fermentation. I certainly don't want a stalled fermentation. Of the over 500 batches that I've brewed in my day, I've had 2 stalled fermentations, and I share the pain of the people who have experienced that before. It is massively annoying. It's sometimes impossible to really figure out what in the world happened. You have to pitch more yeast. You have to, it's a pain in the butt. So if you can get away with avoiding all of that just by pitching the proper amount of yeast and not underpitching, to me, it's very much worth it. Obviously, another big benefit of pitching a proper amount of yeast is that you are at lower risk of developing off flavors in the beer that are a function of yeast stress. Things like diacetyl or fusel alcohols, sulfur, which, that you can scrub sulfur pretty easily, but it doesn't smell good in your garage, I'll tell you. Or unwanted esters. That's one of the things that yeast will do, is produce esters under too much stress.
Yeah, and these are all things that we want various levels of, sometimes none, and yeast pitch rate is one of those ways where you can really dial that in. Absolutely.
And when we talk about underpitching, I think it's important. We can talk a little bit about our personal experiences. When I started brewing, I believe White Labs, this was back in 2003. I believe White Labs, they were definitely using the vials back then. I forget what Yeast was doing. It may have been pouches, but my first kit came with a vial. So I believe it was White Labs. I don't totally remember, but it was certainly a vial. And there was no talk of building up yeast starters. I was just told, hey, this stuff's great. You just toss the liquid stuff right into your wort, and you'll have fermentation in beer. And I consider myself one of the lucky ones. That always worked out for me. And it was 9 batches. I just looked back at all my notes. My first 9 batches all had perfectly fine fermentations, and I didn't contaminate a single one of those batches. I am admittedly very neurotic, so that may have contributed to my success. But I was brewing the day that I came home from the homebrew shop. So I'd go buy my stuff, I'd come home and I would brew. These were extract with steeping grains batches. And then I would pitch that yeast. So my hunch is the freshness of that yeast. We know that viability declines with time. Yet another thing that you have to consider when you're propagating yeast for proper yeast pitch. And so I'm pitching these fresh vials of yeast. That probably is the reason I was able to get away with making these decent beers that didn't have off flavors. Now, there were a few batches that I made that had what I would call that homebrew flavor. They wasn't contaminated. It wasn't like buttery or taste like corn. It just didn't taste like a commercial beer. It wasn't until I started pitching proper pitch rates that I was able to make these beers that I thought, and that my friends were telling me tasted like something you got at a pub. So that to me it's anecdote, but that was what I needed to kind of convince me that, yeah, pitching proper amounts of yeast really does matter.
I totally agree, but I do wonder if there's some interactive variables here. For example, were you getting better at controlling your temperature? Were you starting to maybe oxygenate your wort? Were there any other process improvements that you think could confound this, or is it really isolated to just the pitch rate?
I don't know. You're talking about when I went from the extract with steeping grains essentially into all grain brewing. There was a lot that I changed. I went all grain. I bought a chest freezer fermentation chamber type of thing. I changed every variable that I read on Homebrew Talk, is the reason why homebrewers make crap beer. And sure enough, in the end, when you put all those things together, my beers improved. I started winning awards and all of that stuff. But I don't know. And that's why we tested it out. And we're going to talk about the experiment in the next segment, because we wanted to see, does this pitch rate thing really, what impact does it really have on the perceptible and even objectively measurable aspects of a batch of beer. But let's put a pin in that, because before we get too much into the underpitching thing, we do have to talk a little bit about overpitching. I remember listening to podcasts, reading posts on, Homebrew Talk and other forums online years and years ago about the perils of overpitching and how in doing so, you're gonna reduce the actual flavor of the beer, because I guess the yeast are going to eat up all that good flavor, and could lead to a beer that's very thin in the mouthfeel and watery tasting, even though if you would have pitched it right, it wouldn't be that way purportedly. But then it also could have these yeasty flavors, which to me is kind of if you've ever made bread, it's kind of that smell, when you're propping your yeast to put it in dough. It's not a good thing. And I avoided overpitching again, like the plague, as much as I did underpitching.
Yeah, but at the same time, like listening to Bruce Strong back in like 2013, Jamil and John, they would even say, they would describe the issue of overpitching, but then would caution or clarify. But realistically, at the homebrew level, it's kind of hard to overpitch to the point where you're getting there. It's just so much easier, relatively speaking, to underpitch at our scale.
It really is. And I think a few of the things that have made it easier to pitch proper amounts are Yeast Labs, one, improving their processes, which have extended the shelf life of their product. But then you've got labs like Imperial Yeast and I believe Giga Yeast, who are guaranteeing essentially, double the amount of cells in their homebrew pouches as other labs out there. And that, since we started using Imperial Yeast at Brewlosophy, I haven't needed to make a starter because it gets me close enough to proper pitch rates. Now, of course, sometimes that means if you're making we'll do a fully combined, a Doppelbock, which is a cold fermented high OG lager, you might have to pitch 2 pouches, or it might be worthwhile just as insurance, to build up a starter. Let's talk a little bit about what these recommended pitch rates are. And again, these are general. I really don't know where these came from. Probably a prediction based on experience of brewers over the years. But what is the proper pitch rate, again, ostensibly for ales?
Yeah, so the general rule of thumb is 0.75 million cells per milliliter of wort per degree Plato. And so in my experience for a standard 5-ish gallon, 1050 OG, what's that in Plato? 14 Plato or so, batch of wort, that's about 200 billion cells.
Right. About 200 billion cells, which is probably the reason you got some of these labs who are packaging that much. If you have, when I was making starters for every batch, 10, 12 years ago, the reason we were doing that is, one, we're starting off with a vial or a pouch of yeast that started with an expected or predicted, I should say, 100 billion cells. And then maybe it was 3 or 4 weeks old. So that viability had fallen off a little bit. And so you take that into account. And now you're propping up maybe a 1 liter starter to ensure that those yeast are replicating enough to where you have the number of cells that you really want. I've seen people actually do plate up a starter and they compare it to how much yeast was in the vial beforehand versus how much was in the starter, and it really does. It's pretty simple science. It really does work. You are propagating and creating more yeast cells by using these starters, and so again, you're looking for about 200 billion cells for your standard strength ale, which is going to be fermented between 66 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit, around 19 to 20 C. But when making lagers, and this is where we're going to shift our focus a little bit, the pitch rate is double, 1.5 billion cells per milliliters of wort per degree Plato. Why is that, Jordan?
Well, theoretically, we're fermenting them cold. And with the lower temperature, the yeast just isn't as active. And so, we're fermenting in the realm of 45 to 55 Fahrenheit. What is that in Celsius?
45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit is somewhere around 10 C. You're looking between 8 and 11 C.
There you go. That's way colder than fermenting at 66 Fahrenheit. And so you have less, activity due to the lower temperature. And so we need, in theory, more yeast cells present to be able to push through such a cold environment. And in turn, that means that we're ensuring that it's going to ferment all the way through, not have some sort of aggressive lag time. And a big thing with lager is suppressing esters. We do not want that in lager. And that's really the hallmark of the style is low to no esters. And that's why the industry recommends you actually go double the ale pitch rate given these variables that are happening at the same time.
Exactly. If you look at fermentation in general, and focusing specifically on temperature, we know that yeast are going to work faster, like most things do. The warmer the environment is. That's just the case for things. Chemical reactions occur faster as a function of temperature, up to certain points, of course. And I forget what the principle is called, whatever. But we know that temperature has an effect or an impact on the speediness with which things occur, and that the same goes for yeast. So you could toss any brewer's yeast into a 100 degree wort, and it's not going to kill it. I forget what the temperature is where yeast will just go kaput. But you toss it into a 90 degree to a 95 degree wort, and that yeast is going to do its thing. It may produce off flavors because that is a pretty stressful environment. It's doing its thing a little bit too fast. It's sweating a little too much, as it were. And those flavors are going to be present in that beer, whether it's fusel alcohol or an extreme amount of esters or phenolic characteristics. The same goes for fermenting outside on the lower end of that scale, in the cooler, those cooler temperatures, those yeasts are going to be more sluggish. It's so cold, they're going to work slower. So the theory is that by pitching more, not only are you going to reduce that lag time, which I'm a big fan of, but you're encouraging a more aggressive or a more just a stronger fermentation overall, and the hope there being that it fully attenuates to where you want it to end your final gravity quicker. And more clean. So you're not producing, there's enough yeast there so that, the other ones don't have to stress out too much and produce all those off flavors. It's a pretty simple theory that to me, as a brewer of 20 plus years, it makes sense,
Yeah. And, they say that a lot of the flavor contribution from yeast happens in the first 24 hours or so. And you have to think about how this relates to the life cycle of yeast in a fermentation. The first part is the lag time, the lag phase, right? And then after that, I think it's the growth phase. And so when we have a low temperature, it's really tough if it's starting with just a really small amount of cells in the solution. But a lot of lager brewers are actually raising the temperatures over the course of fermentation to encourage complete attenuation. Of course, we want to do make sure that we don't have any diacetyl present. And so by going up to like 60 Fahrenheit or so, we can actually start to burn off some of that diacetyl. And so that's why we want to make sure that there is sufficient yeast in solution in a lager when we're starting really cold and getting through that lag and growth phase.
Absolutely. And I've had the question before, our main focus in this episode is a cool fermented pale lager style of beer. But a lot more people these days are more comfortable fermenting at warmer temps, whether that's 55, 60 F, maybe up to 66 F, like I do. That's about 19C. I've had the question, well, what pitch rate do I go with? Do I go with ale since you're doing it at ale temps or lager? Absolutely. You go ale. I mean, the whole idea behind lager pitch rates, as far as I can tell on my research and what I've been, discussing for the last 2 decades, the sole reason you're pitching double the amount of cells into a lager is because you're pitching it into a wort that is, 15 to 20 degrees cooler, Fahrenheit at least, cooler than if it were an ale. And so you really want to bolster the viability, the number of yeast cells there so it does the job properly. Now, there are a few ways to go about ensuring you have a proper pitch rate. We've hit on both of them already, but just to clarify, you can just pitch more than one pouch. I think that's an easy way. Probably the easiest, though arguably the most expensive. Another thing that I've done a few times, I'm curious if you've tried this. I know that you have, Jordan, but is harvesting yeast slurry, and whether you rinse it or not, usually that is going to be highly viable yeast slurry, even if it has some other Trubin stuff in it. You've got, if you take it from a freshly fermented batch, you harvest that, you pitch, a half a quart or something like that, and you have got far more than enough yeast to ferment a nice cold fermented lager. Have you done that? Have you tried that with a lager beer?
All the time. I love repitching. A lot of pro brewers say that yeast strains don't really hit their stride until 4th generation or so. It's a huge cost savings that home brewers can realize by just in a very sanitary method, saving yeast from a prior fermentation in a jar. And I will say for the listeners, a good rule of thumb is that 1 milliliter of pure slurry, so let it fall out of solution in your jars, and then looking at the milliliters of pure paste is about 1 billion cells. I'm sorry, is about 2 billion cells. So if you have 100 milliliters of pure yeast paste, that's about 200 billion cells. And so then you can kind of use this as just a really easy rule of thumb. We're probably being a little conservative. It's probably even a little more than that. And I found that works really well just to pitch by volume.
Yeah, some of the shortest lag times and most vigorous fermentations that I've had with cold fermented lagers, I mean, these are lagers that I've fermented down at 46 to 48 degrees Fahrenheit. That's like 8C, have been repitching, freshly harvested yeast. I've also done it. I've propagated yeast in starters, split that starter, put one in the fridge for a couple of days, and then just pitched that into a wort, and it works phenomenally well. So those are some options. I think the most common one, though, for people is just to propagate a starter that's specifically going to be pitched into a batch of wort. So you're building up that starter for a batch based on the batch's OG, the volume that you're brewing and such. And it's really easy. You can go to, I believe Brew United is the calculator that I prefer. Mr. Malty may still be up. There's a calculator calculator there. But Brewfather, which is our preferred brewing calculator these days, they have a fantastic yeast starter calculator. I know Beersmith has one as well. So all of those tools are out there. People, I've talked to a lot of people who, whether they're emailing me or coming up to me in the homebrew club meeting or whatever, who seem really anxious to step into making yeast starters. I mean, you're going to save money. It may not be that much these days because you're still buying DME. It takes some time. And as my grandpa used to say, time is money. But it's really easy to do. And you don't have to put it on a stir plate. I mean, back in the day when Brewlosophy first got started, Jordan, the number of stir plates that I had sent to me because people like these boutique, stir plate manufacturers were sending me stuff to check out and stuff. It seems like most people aren't even really doing that anymore these days. They're just, making these kind of standalone starters. I don't know.
Yeah, and so that's another thing when it comes to starters is that the spinning the starter on a stir plate, for example, or if you had some sort of like laboratory type shaker, that will encourage more yeast growth than just a stagnant amount of yeast just sitting in a jar at room temperature. And so, by agitating it, we can actually increase the cell count. And the starter calculators out there, like, yeastcalculator.com, I think is still out there even. They have settings where you can specify whether it's a sitting, stagnant, whether you're spinning it. And some of them even have like occasionally shaking just by hand. And so I really encourage people, if you're going to do a starter, just get on the internet and calculate, the actual amount that you're trying to make here. Because, if you're going through the effort, it seems that you can also just double check that you're making the right amount. Because, some people just say, just make 2 liter starter and call it good. Well, I mean, it's not that hard to just look on the internet to see how much you need.
Yeah. No, I don't disagree with you on that one. If you're going to make starters, you might as well just add the extra 3 minutes and determine the exact amount you need to make. Are there any particulars? I'm curious if you're going to hit on what I'm thinking here when it comes to making starters for lager beers that you follow.
Really not really, other than just calculating how much I need. And one thing that I remember wondering as a young homebrewer trying my first lager yeast starter is what temperature do I spin this thing at?
Exactly.
And so, I believe the Yeast book confirms this, and I actually talked to Yeast, which is local with me, and they confirm this. Just ale temperatures, 70 degrees, works great. We're not concerned about the esters that are created during that phase because it's going to go into a subsequent fermentation, the entire batch of beer. The other thing is I learned a long time ago to relax, and it's okay to pitch the entire starter. The rule of thumb is like as long as it's less than like 10% or so, even 15%, I wouldn't be too freaked out about it. So I don't crash and then decant because then I'm just putting the yeast back to sleep and it's just one more step and it just adds more days. So I just pitch the whole thing.
Yeah, we actually have an experiment on pitching the whole thing versus decanting, and getting rid of all that supernatant. But that's for another show if we haven't already covered it. All right, real quick, let's spend a little bit of time talking about the style that we focused on for this experiment. We're going to talk about in a minute. International Pale Lager. This is, as the BJCP defines it, a highly attenuated pale lager with strong flavors, typically well balanced and highly carbonated. You got to serve it cold, and it is very refreshing and thirst quenching. I could not agree more. It's one of my favorite pale lager styles. For those who are wondering about maybe some commercial examples that are easy to get your hands on, you can go snag yourself an Asahi or a Sapporo. Those are some of my favorites. I actually believe that even things like Pacifico and some of the Mexican lagers are included under that International Pale Lager umbrella. There is a wide variety of flavors and such. What makes it that pale lager, though, is the fact that it is traditionally fermented cool at about 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10°C, give or take, and which again means that the yeast is going to work slower. It can put more stress on the yeast. So you want to ensure high viability. You want to ensure that there is enough yeast in that wort or in that beer to properly ferment it, to produce you this nice, clean end result, which is what we're all after when making these styles of beer. So that proper pitch rate, you're going to reduce lag, hopefully have more active fermentation and no off flavors in the end. So I built up yeast starters for every batch of lager I made up until a few years ago. In fact, I had to buy a couple 5-liter Erlenmeyer flasks just to be able to propagate the amount of yeast cells recommended for lager styles. It wasn't that big of a pain. I mean, making starters is pretty simple, as we discussed discussed earlier, but was it really having a meaningful impact on my beer? Well, Jordan, you were curious to see what impact underpitching has on an international pale lager, and you designed an experiment to test it out. Results from that experiment when we're back from this break. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. In addition to the original gravity of wort and the starting cell count, an important consideration when determining the proper pitch rate for a beer is the temperature at which it will be fermented. And seeing as lagers are typically fermented cooler than ales, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees C, they are widely believed to require double the pitch rate as you would if you were fermenting in an ale. Jordan, you were curious about this claim and performed an experiment to see for yourself.
Yeah, so this is around the time that the Imperial Yeast Seasonal L25 Hygge, that's Hygge, maybe I'm pronouncing that right, came out, and I was really excited to give this yeast a try. And so my instant assumption was that it was sourced from like the Carlsberg brewery. And so I thought, what better style to make is kind of like a Carlsberg clone, a international pale lager. And earlier when you were describing the different commercial examples, it's amazing how many countries are represented in this kind of style umbrella. I think that Red Stripe out of Jamaica is included. We have European examples. There's probably African examples. So it's really the world's beverage, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of talk in the brewlosophy world around pitch rate, and me being a traditionalist and kind of one of my early experiments with the crew, I was like, I know exactly what I want to test out. So with the intention of testing really pitch rate in a traditionally fermented pale lager, I started with 2 pouches of Imperial Yeast L25 Hygge the day before brewing and put that on a starter. So looking for a proper pitch rate according to my preferred yeast calculator of around 280 billion cells given the OG for a standard, 5-ish gallon batch of cold fermented lager. And so the yeast calculator determined that a 1.5 liter starter would conveniently give me just enough to test the variable, about 430 billion cells. So 2/3 of that 1 liter is 287 billion cells. So that's right on the money for that proper lager pitch rate. And then a half liter, 1/3 of it would be 143 billion cells. That's an underpitch. That's an ale pitch rate effectively.
So it's about half of the recommended pitch rate, which is why we're saying it's around an ale pitch rate. I mean, that is still 143 billion cells. That's a lot of yeast cells. I mean, that is going to ferment an ale beautifully, even like a 1060, 1065 OG ale. But again, we have to keep in mind, this is going to be cold fermented, which is key. Hence pitching, 287 billion cells as the proper pitch rate, and 143 billion cells we're calling an underpitch for this batch.
Yeah, and realistically, yeast is going to do its thing. And so, much like Martin's recent episode on the Brewlosophy Show on YouTube, to me, it's a bit of insurance. Why not? Let's just follow the rules and hopefully, nothing goes wrong.
But even more, if that underpitch batch comes back, now we've done multiple, yeast pitch rate experiments. This one just happens to be on a cold fermented lager. If it happens to come back not tasting as good as the proper pitch rate one, then we've got some real grist. We got some grist for that mill. Hey, listen, this is actually meaningful beyond, something else, just the talk. It's more than just insurance, I guess.
Exactly. So I was brewing a single 9-gallon batch of International Pale Lager that I would split between two 4.5-gallon batches because I'm fermenting these in 5-gallon standard corny kegs. And so since this variable is not being introduced until the cold side, I just did a single 9-gallon batch to mitigate any sort of confounding variance related to the hot side. So it's a really simple grist that I brought for this brew. Just totally, what do I think would make a good International Pale Lager? I did 97% pale 2-row malt and 3% Carahel. And I'm sure listeners are immediately like, wait, what? You're using American 2-row malt in an International Pale Lager? You can't do that. And it's actually kind of a funny story. So, my local homebrew store, rated number 2 homebrew store in the world this year in Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. F.H. Steinbart, incredible guys, incredible homebrew store. They hooked me up with some Pilsner malt, and it was a partial bag that someone hadn't bought some of it out of, and it was in the warehouse and stuff. I took it home, and the water's hot, and I opened up the bag, and it was not Pilsner malt. I don't know what it was. It was clearly like someone's batch that they ordered online. And it was like a mixed grist of various, different malts. There was some like dark malt in there. It was pre-crushed. Who knows how long it had been sitting back there, but it was in a bag marked like Weyermann Pilsner. And so we didn't realize until the water was hot that I actually didn't have a bag of Pilsner on hand. And being, water's hot, everything's ready to go. I had 2-row. And so I actually Googled, Brewlosophy 2-row versus Pilsner. Sure enough, there was a comparison. And that study found that tasters could not reliably differentiate a lager beer made with pale 2-row versus Pilsner malt. So that kind of empowered me, it's going to be great. Let's go for it. And so funny side little story there. I entered this beer in the first round of NHC and it medaled with pale 2-row. And so clearly you can make great International Pale Lager with 2-row. And so I wasn't too surprised that it worked out.
No, I love it. Yeah. Man, the Pilsner and pale 2-row malt are so incredibly similar. I get why people want to believe that they're vastly different, and perhaps different maltsters do make different versions and whatnot. But they're so close that you can absolutely get away with making a beautiful, obviously a beautiful pale lager beer with pale malt. It's going to work just fine. Serviceable
to say the least. So kind of a standard, even kind of simple for me brewing process, because I just did a single infusion mash of 148F, that's 64C, for 60 minutes. The thought being is that an International Pale Lager is kind of simple, and so I don't need the alleged complexity that a step mash would bring me, so I made it a little easier on myself there. Once that mash was complete, remove those grains and boiled for 60 minutes. Very simple hopping schedule, 48 grams of Hallertau Mittelfrüh at 60 minutes and another 56 minutes at 20 minutes in this 9-gallon batch.
I love both of those hops. I mean, I say both of those hops. I like your hopping regimen there, and I love Hallertau Mittelfrüh so incredibly much. It's one of my favorites, up there with Tettninger. I'm imagining how good this beer must have tasted. But hey, we want to know how good both tasted and if people could tell them apart. So carry on.
Exactly. So after the boil was complete, the wort was chilled and refac readings confirmed. It was at 1046 OG, right on the money. So then identical volumes of wort were split between 2 fermentation kegs and left to finish chilling before to my desired pitching temperature of 46F or 8C. So at this point, it's time to bring in the variable. So I pulled that starter off the plate and used a flask or whatever to evenly measure out evenly homogenized amounts of the starter. So I pitched 1 liter or 287 billion cells into one of the kegs, while the other received the remaining half liter, which is approximately 143 billion cells.
So, okay, before we move on to, there's a lot to be talked about here because not only do we have our sensory analysis data, but we're watching these beers. We're observing fermentation. We want to see if there's going to be any objectively measurable differences just in the fermentation activity. What would we expect? We talked a little bit before about increased lag and, more sluggish fermentation on an underpitched batch. But, given the context here, you're still pitching 143 billion cells into this underpitched batch. That seems like a lot. Did you have any expectations going into this one?
I don't know if I necessarily thought that there would be too much of a difference in terms of like objective measurements like attenuation, et cetera. But I was assuming that there would be a flavor impact and it would just taste kind of homebrewy, the underpitch batch. But sure enough, we actually saw some interesting measurable differences in terms of the fermentation. So those beers were left to ferment at 48F or 9C for a week before I kind of employed that tasty or Narcissus schedule where I started raising the temperature gradually over the course of a few days to ultimately reach 60 Fahrenheit or 16C for a diacetyl rest. So we're now at 2 weeks, right? And I took a hydrometer measurement. And so that proper pitch rate batch, 1011 FG, sounds about right. I think this thing is done fermenting. So then I took a measurement of the underpitch batch, and Marshall, it was at 1020 FG.
So here's the thing. There's a wide, I think not widely held, but a, somewhat held belief that brulosophy exists to try to like snub our noses at tradition and all of that. That is not the case whatsoever. In fact, I've said this before, but I started the experiment series to prove to myself why these certain variables were important. And, we kind of did the opposite, I suppose. But this was one of those things when this data came back and you're like, whoa, the underpitch batch is actually doing what the books would suggest would happen, which is not attenuating as fast as the proper pitch rate batch. That was pretty interesting to me. And when that kind of stuff happens, at least for me, I do start to wonder, okay, I could see this leading to, a perceptible difference in these beers. If it's not fermenting faster, that yeast is obviously a little bit more stressed and is likely going to produce some of these other byproducts that you don't want in a nice, clean, pale lager.
Right. And so I think this is coming back to what you said earlier about pitching warm. We don't necessarily need as much yeast when pitching warm. Like we said, this is a function of temperature. And so that's why if you're going to be one of those people that ferment lagers warm, a single pouch of imperial yeast is going to be sufficient probably for fermenting a lager warm. But as we saw here, if you're going to be fermenting cold, the study is seeming to suggest that a proper pitch rate might actually be a good idea.
Just for the more objective stuff, not even for the sensory stuff here. Right now, we're just saying, okay, yeah, this is kind of proof in the pudding that pitching a proper amount of yeast, having that good high viability, does seem to have lead to faster fermentation, which is always a good thing in my opinion. So very interesting start on the data, and curious to see where this is going to end up. So you left these beers alone for another week before taking another set of hydrometer measurements. And what were they like after that week?
Yeah, I wanted to let it go for another week because I thought it was unfair to just the one of them's done, so it's time to keg them up because who knows if there's going to be remaining diacetyl, et cetera. And I really thought this thing is just taking longer. It's not that it's stalled. And so after another week, the proper pitch rate batch remained at 1011 FG. And so it really was already at terminal after 2 weeks, which is my standard time for lager with a diacetyl rest. I've never need to wait 3 weeks for a lager to finish with my cold fermentation, but using proper pitch rates. Meanwhile, the underpitch rate had gone down and is now at 1016 FG, and I waited another day, and it continued to stay at 1016. I don't know if I'd wait another month if it finally would have reached 1011, but I figured it's time to move on. Let's keg these things up. So I called it good once it was seeming to stabilize at 1016 FG.
Yeah, I actually question whether leaving it alone longer would have helped bring would have improved the overall attenuation. But I can't explain why it would stop at 1016 versus 1011 when those worts were identical. I mean, you made it together and split it between identical fermentation kegs even. So it is interesting, and really the only difference being pitch rate. It does seem to kind of focus the lens a little bit on that as the factor for this outcome.
Right. And so I was convinced there would be a difference. And so obviously that's why we do the taster in the triangle tests. So
Yep.
first, we got to get into a keg, right? So I began slowly reducing the temperatures over the course of a few days until they were at 32 Fahrenheit or 0 Celsius. After that was then sufficiently cold crashed, I then pressure transferred both to sanitized CO2 purged kegs, placed it on gas at serving pressure in the keezer, and let them lager for 3 weeks before I began to serve them to tasters.
So you even lagered these beers. I mean, you are not skipping any steps in this. These are fairly traditionally made international pale lagers, and you're giving that underpitched one equal chance. I mean, you're not doing anything else to it to make it different than the other one. We really do want to see if people can perceive a difference between these beers. When you poured those two glasses next to each other and you're looking at them, we do our dorky little things where we hold them up to the light and whatnot. Did you notice any differences in the way they looked?
Not really. I think they looked the same. And when you look at the website, I don't think that you're going to really see much of a difference there. Effectively identical, pale yellow color, a little hazy due to the amount of lagering time, only 3 weeks, and a really nice stark white cap of foam.
Yeah, and you didn't use any sort of finings. I don't even think you used finings in the kettle or anything. So, that slight haze is nothing. It was mostly clear. I mean, you could see through it. It just wasn't bright, I suppose. But it looked like both of them looked like solid versions of International Pale Lager to me.
Yeah, it was really nice. And so I then, poured myself some side-by-sides and tried to taste the difference, like bias, known and being able to visually look at them. But I also did some kind of semi-blind triangle tests. And so out of my semi-blind, I did 5. I only got 2 right. And I was shocked that the beers really tasted the same, grainy, doughy malt character, some appropriate supporting hop bitterness, really clean fermentation profile. If I could probably convince myself that there was a slight difference when I did them side by side in clear glassware. But I mean, it was so slight that who knows if there really was anything there, which blew my mind that I could not taste the difference between 5 gravity points.
That I think that's more key. It's not that we could easily focus on, it blows my mind that underpitching didn't result in a estery beer or whatever. But the truth of the matter is there was 5 FG point difference in these finished beers. One of those beers was lower in alcohol than the other, and yet they still tasted identical. That is something that we've been able to show over and over and over again in various contexts, that level of alcohol to a certain extent doesn't seem to be something people can reliably perceive. And that to me is fascinating.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder if some of it's related to water chemistry. The article shows the ppms I was going for, and I'm kind of crisping it up with some sulfates and whatnot. So I could not tell the difference really. And like you said, it wasn't like the underpitch beer was an estery like mess of just newbie homebrew offness. And so I was really surprised how reasonably good it was and effectively tasted the same to my palate.
Yeah. Well, obviously, though, Jordan, you don't matter. I don't matter. It's the blind participants who matter the most. You served this beer or these beers, the triangle test, to 20 different participants, out of which 11 would have had to identify the unique sample in order for us to say with some level of confidence that it does seem to be a real difference between them. Out of those 11, how many people actually were able to identify the odd beer out?
8 or only 40%, which is just about the number we would expect due to chance, which is not significant. And so ultimately we conclude that tasters could not reliably tell 2 beers apart, where one was an international pale lager fermented with the proper pitch rate and one was underpitched with a kind of standard ale pitch rate when fermented cold.
Absolutely. This is not only a wildly interesting, in my opinion, finding, but it's one that corroborates past experiments on pitch rate as well. And I think that leads to some, at least for me personally, some interesting implications. Like you mentioned earlier, I think pitch rate is one of those things that a lot of us do or focus on as a means of insurance. We just want to do, even if it doesn't cause a perceptible difference, we do want to ensure that the lag is reduced, that fully attenuated beers, all of that stuff. And if there's a chance that it's going to produce a cleaner lager in the end, then we want to go that route. And I think that's still the importance of pitch rate. This does not mean that pitch rate isn't important. It does not mean that if you were to pitch a quarter of the proper, recommended pitch rate, that it wouldn't lead to some off flavors. At some point, I'm sure it would, if it would even ferment the beer at all, even. But just because people couldn't taste the difference, this experiment in particular showed that pitch rate still does matter. It still had an impact. It was just on things other than that which we taste, smell, and feel in our mouths.
Right. And maybe if we had like a gallon of yeast slurry that was so old that it was at that point estimated to be the viability associated with like 100 billion cells, and you pitch the whole thing, like maybe that would, you could probably have yeast that was beat up enough that the pitch rate would become an important variable of ultimate flavor profile. But this was healthy, viable, fresh yeast. And so the results seem to suggest that if you don't have enough yeast, or you're not willing, to go the extra mile to make the proper pitch rate, at least with the Huga strain, may she rest in peace, it's no longer available as we speak, that you could still make a reasonably good beer. Now, for me personally, I'm going to still do the proper pitch rates, one, because, I just can't get over my confirmation bias, but it clearly it made a difference, right? And if anything, like Martin said in the recent YouTube episode, it's just cheap insurance.
Yeah. And I totally am on board with that as well. And I have an anecdote of a massively underpitched beer that I made. In fact, I had just been, I think this was back in 2000, it must have been 10 or 11. I had been reading about this whole brew in a bag thing. I'd picked up a bag off of Amazon. It was my first one that ripped very, very easily. But yeah, I had a free couple of hours. And so I decided to go out and try this BIAB approach. And I made a Kolsch, very simple Kolsch, chilled it down to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And I had a little jar of leftover, Kolsch yeast in my fridge that I had harvested probably 5 months prior. And I just figured, what the heck, this pitch rate thing is bohunkus, as my grandpa used to say. And I pitched that into the beer, and I came out the next morning and my garage smelled like somebody had been doing burnouts. It was like burnt rubber and dog farts. It was awful. And that beer was undrinkably bad. It was so gross that I had to dump it. It was one of my first dumpers. I'm glad it didn't take me very long to brew, because it was very disappointing having to, pour this stuff down the drain. But that is a perfect example of a massive, massive underpitch. I had this really old yeast, viability had fallen off the cliff, and it really did show in that beer. So pitch rate is something you want to mind. Now, do you need to go exactly with what the recommendations say? You don't have to. And I've pitched cold fermented lagers. I've pitched one pouch of, say, Imperial Yeast L13 Global or L17 Harvest, fermented cool, and they turn out just fine. They attenuate well. So your mileage may vary, but I do still think pitch rate is good insurance. Now, we've got a couple of comments that I think we should get to on this one that people left on the article. The first one comes from Tinker Tim. He says, I think you're right in the conclusion that there's some tolerance on pitch rates, but the pitch rates in this experiment are all assumed based on the count in the packs and the pitch rate calculator. Pack counts and starter growth can and do vary significantly from the assumptions. So I think you might be successful with lower pitch rates some of the time, but there's a risk in doing so.
Yeah, and that's one thing that there's been some discussion in the industry about, like, what if we had strain specific yeast calculators and stuff like that? Like, let's set aside the variability associated with packaging and acknowledge that there's going to be an error band there, but they're doing their best to kind of, get close. And an Imperial employee said that if anything, it might be a little higher than 200. Yeah. They want to, hedge their bets there. But one of the dry yeast companies, I wish I remember which one, Lauman or the other one, Fermentus, actually has made a strain-specific yeast calculator, and they're finding different growth rates, pitch rate needs, et cetera, per strain. And so it's a great comment, and hopefully we get to the point where we can really dial these things in and be strain-specific.
That is fascinating. I was unaware of that, Jordan, and it actually made me think, I think a relevant experience of mine, of the many times that I have used the Pilsner Urquell strain. That's WLP 800. I think they just call it Pilsner yeast or something like that. But it is what Imperial Yeast sells as, I forget what the number, L20, I believe, but it's Urquell. And that strain, every single time I use it, whether I'm pitching a starter or I'm pitching direct, whether I'm fermenting cool, whether I'm fermenting warm, it just has more lag. It takes longer for it to get up and going. Whereas I pitch a pouch of L17 into a 50 degree Fahrenheit or 10 degree C wort, and that thing's fermenting away, in 12 hours. Urkel, it's like, if it's 24 hours and I don't see bubbles, in my airlock, then I'm not terribly surprised. That's just what I've come to expect. So it would be interesting to see what a pitch rate calculator spits out for Urkel versus say Global or something. I don't know. That's fascinating. Commenter Finn Berger says, I just did a little experiment with low pitch rate with that same yeast in a Pilsner. He basically did exactly what we did around the same time. I used 1 pack of fresh Hoog, I don't know how to say it, Higgy, Hoog, whatever, in 25 liters and fermented it at 8 to 9 C, about 48 degrees Fahrenheit, same as the experiment. That is a little less than 200 billion cells in 6.5 gallons. I normally use double that cell count, but the beer went from 1050 to 1010, as I would expect with a normal pitch in normal time, and it tastes to me no different from my other Pilsners, which I think are fairly clean and nice. To me, this indicates that if you have yeast you can trust to be in perfect shape, you really don't need to use twice as much for cold fermented lagers.
Yeah, and then getting back to your anecdote you said just a second ago, I think that vitality is really important here too.
Absolutely.
If you have, there's a relationship between viability and vitality, I would imagine. And obviously pitch rate, the count of cells is important. But if that yeast is so old and beat up, you could have a rubbery mess. And so I think that freshness is really key. And there's been some experiments on the website, I believe, on that. What's more important, viability or vitality? And you will hear some, talking heads, brew scientists, et cetera, say that maybe vitality is really what's important here. And viability is kind of our corollary that we use to ensure good vitality.
Yeah, I've heard that as well, that viability is the insurance, vitality is what actually gets the job done, basically. And I think both are important. And, the ideal is high viability, high vitality. If you can ensure that, then you're probably going to have a really good fermentation. The one thing I would caution, at least people interpreting from us, you and me, Jordan, and Brewlosophy in general, is Finn's comment on you really don't need to use twice as much for cold fermented lagers. I'm not sure it's a need thing. Do what you want to do. And if you like the outcome, then you can keep doing it. If you're not worried about the insurance part of it, then you honestly do not need to pitch twice as much, assuming that yeast is viable and vital. And those are really what's key. So again, this is your mileage may vary variable in my opinion. Final comment comes from SGP, who says, this result matches my own experience. I consistently underpitch, and he put that in quotes, all my beers, and it works just fine. I've tried a couple of times to use a recommended amount of yeast, but it makes no perceivable difference to me at all. I don't see why it wouldn't work. The yeast will multiply in the fermenter just as it multiplies in the starter. What's the difference? There might possibly be a difference in the wort if the wort is very high OG, but you've done an experiment on that too. This is just another homebrewing myth. There are quite a few of them. I guess the difference is the time to ferment, but that only applies if you don't count the time it took to make the starter. Interesting points.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of homebrewing is you do you, right? And that's what I love about Brewlosophy is we really are demonstrating, what works, what can you fudge? Ooh, maybe that does make a difference and you should pay attention to that, like cold side oxidation. And this is just another, piece for the proverbial, grist for the proverbial mill. And, it's going to be okay either way a lot of the times as long as your yeast is reasonably healthy.
Yeah, I would never, ever, ever, and I'm not saying this tongue in cheek, I would never call any of these process variables that we've tested out or that we all engage in when making a batch of beer a myth. I don't when I hear myth, I think of something that was created intentionally to kind of train or to keep people from doing things or whatever. I think all of the process variables that we employ, whether, they like decoction, which is very convoluted and likely doesn't seem to have much of a need these days. They were developed at a time when they were needed. And so they're not myth as much as they are maybe unnecessary or less necessary these days. So the biggest myth, in my opinion, is that those of us who sit behind a microphone are somehow more expert than the people who have been brewing just as long who aren't talking about it. So don't take what we're saying, any of us, I caution you against taking anything that we say as being, absolute fact. That's just not the case. We're just like you. We just happen to talk about it on a podcast or whatever and write about it on a website. So is the whole need for a yeast starter a myth? No, but I don't think it's necessarily needed. I've shown that it's not in my own personal, brewing. But it does help, and it is good insurance, and there's science to show, and even this experiment kind of indicated that pitching proper pitch rates or amounts of yeast really does seem to have some benefits, even if it's just the objectively measurable stuff. So, well, that is all the time that we've got on the impact the yeast pitch rate has on international pale lager. Do you have any last words before we wrap things up, Jordan?
Just make sure you're pitching healthy yeast, and if you're like me, use a yeast calculator to make sure you're using the amount that they recommend.
Absolutely. And another thing to keep in mind, when we say healthy yeast, a part of that is viability, a part of that is vitality, and both of those are impacted by, the source of your yeast, the way that it's stored, how fresh it is, and stuff like that. Well, don't forget to check out the Brew Lab, where Jordan regularly joins Brewlosophy's Cade Job in the lab to discuss the fascinating research folks are doing on brewing and beer. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through